Hey, BassGeek here, and today I'm going to share with you some of my favorite baits to catch spawning smallmouth, and I'm going to show you how I fish them. So I'm going to start off telling you that fishing for smallmouth on the beds or spawning smallmouth where I live is probably going to be a little different than what they do up north. Maybe a little different than what they do out west, and the few fisheries that are further south than us, may be a little different. But I think you can take some of these techniques and some of this stuff and kind of translate it into the places where you live, which will help you catch more bedding smallmouth. So where do you find spawning smallmouth? How do you find smallmouth on the beds? You can't sight fish them most of the time like you do for largemouth. One of the ways that we've kind of came up with around here is we've all kind of learned what kind of rock they spawn on. So spawning smallmouth don't generally spawn in the backs of coves. We live on highlands reservoirs. So as you can see behind me, the banks are very steep. I always joke that most of the lakes that I fish, there's no such thing as flats. The banks go from steep to steeper. And so that means we have to look at the type of rock. One of the first types of rocks that we look for around here is a rock we call shell rock, but it's actually a slate rock. Now, one of the keys to this slate rock for us is that the seams run horizontally. When you find that rock that those seams are running vertically, sometimes they'll be on it spawning if it kind of comes down and creates a shelf, but most of the time that horizontal shelf, as it drops down into the water, that's really the type of rock you're looking for. Now, there's another type of rock, and it's kind of like a sandstone rock. And this rock actually creates kind of shelves too, but it has, kind of clay mud or some fine sand between it. And these rocks will actually protrude up from the bottom. And they're not really spawning on the rocks, but they'll spawn in between those rocks. And you've seen me and Chris fish a section a couple of weeks ago or last week. The second stop we made in that video was that exact type of spot. So the last spot that you really want to look for, it's the same kind of spot you seen me catch the 4-pounder in to end the video last week. And those are your shallow humps or your long tapering points. But the good humps and good points are going to have the same type of rock that we previously talked about. One of those two types, generally, there's going to be a section of rock where those smallmouth will spawn on. Now that you can't see them, you've got to determine the depth that they're at. A good starting point for depth is probably that 6 to 12 foot range. That's a good spot to start. But there's a lot of factors that come into play when you're trying to determine those depths. Let's look at last year when I was fishing for the BFL. The lake, we got a sudden influx of rain. It warmed up a lot sooner than it did this year, so the bass were going to the beds earlier than they did this year. Now, as it rained, the water level raised, and you had a lot of spawners that are out 15, 20, 25 feet. But as the water level settled, you then had another wave come in, and we were, the majority, me and some of the other guys like Richard that I talked to with Bass Munitions, we actually were catching them probably in the neighborhood of that 6 to 12 foot range, so a little shallower. It's hard to determine. You're not really going to be able to use your depth finders to find them, even though I did find some of the deeper ones. But that's the thing, since you can't see them, you're really going to have to look for those areas that have the right rock and the right contour. Now it comes to this year, and the last video you've seen with me and Chris catching spawning smallmouth. Now we were catching them in 3 foot of water. And what ended up happening is that it stayed cold longer. The lake muddied up. Now water clarity will be another factor that you have to factor in. Last year, during the BFL, the water was a lot clearer. so they'll spawn out deeper. This year, the water is a lot more muddy for some reason. We got a lot more rain last year. I don't get it. But all that being said, water clarity is another big factor you're going to have to take in. So this year, the water came up, the temperature stayed down, and then suddenly came up, and then the water began to drop. So these fish come up, maybe originally they were spawning in, let's say, 5 to 8 feet. But as the water dropped, you've seen us catching them in roughly about 3 foot of water. So again, make sure you take in consideration the rock and the water clarity. Those are going to be 2 big factors. Okay, so let's talk about the baits themselves. And the very first one is probably the most famous in my area. As a matter of fact, it's kind of the code word for the smallmouth or bedding in a couple of different lakes. And that's called the little green worm. Now there's several different people, several different companies that make them, but probably the most favorite in my area and the one that I use is going to absolutely be the Bass Munitions Holston ST. So let me tell you a little bit about the setup. Now guys, this is my buddy Richards from Bass Munitions. This is his setup. He's using an Enigma rod and a Daiwa reel. You can use about anything you want. You know, I'll throw it on a medium, a 7 foot to a 6.5 medium fast action rod with a nice little tip, because the weight that you're actually throwing, you know, most of the time if it's windy, you know, you can go up some, but most of the time you're going to throw this on a 3/16 ounce bullet weight. So it's a small weight, a very finesse presentation. The other thing is the hook. Now, me and Richard both obviously use offset worm hooks, not EWGs, okay? EWGs can cause problems on the hook set, and a lot of times these bass are going to come up and just take it by the tail. So you want a hook that's really going to dig in and get to the meat of that smallmouth. The other thing is, most of the time we're going to use a 1/0 hook, but if you're getting a lot of short strikes, so if they're picking it up off by the tail, off the bed, and relocating the worm, and you're not able to get a hook in them, we'll actually go to a 2/0 hook. That'll help get the hook moved down the worm a little bit more and closer to the tail. So the second bait that I really discovered, it was actually showed to me by Chris this year. You know, I'd already knew about it, I'd fished it, but I hadn't actually used it for bedding or spawning smallmouth. And that is the flick shake. Now, there's, you've seen me and Chris use a lot of different worms, everything from robo worms, and Bass Munitions makes several different worms that I actually like to fish on it. And the Torpedo, the Holston ST, the Seeker, the Crawler, there's a lot of different ones, and he makes some really good colors. The 2 colors that seem to stand out the most, and guys, before we really get into colors, the first thing you need to know about colors, the little green worm, if it's really clear water, which it has not been this year, will throw other colors. Bold bluegill, morning dawn, for example, seem to be 2 of the hot colors this year. So not necessarily the little green worm. Remember, that's just kind of code for they're up on the bed. We'll throw the green worm, but you really want to take in water clarity. That's a big deal, even when they're on the bed. Now the line we're going to use, it's pretty much across the board for all these baits. It's going to be 6 to 8 pound test fluorocarbon. Now whatever fluorocarbon you're comfortable with, you know, I'll use Seagar. I know my buddy Tim and I think Chris, they like Sunline, and my buddy Richard, he uses McCoy. So, you know, it's just whatever you're comfortable with, but 6 to 8 pound test. So now let's go over the setup that I use for the flick shake. Let's start with the actual head. Now the head, again, it's adjustable, and I'll be honest with you, you know, you guys know I co-angle. I fish the BFLs as a co-angler, and so I can't carry a lot of stuff. So I was actually using anywhere from, you know, they're heavier, which is like a 1/5. I don't remember what their lighter is, and a lot of that's going to depend on the depth you're fishing and the wind. You know, you've got to keep constant contact with the bottom with all these baits. That's the key. You want to put it in those spawning smallmouth's bed so that it just drives them crazy. And that's probably one thing that I left out real quick. You know, spawning smallmouth are super aggressive. So it's not like fishing for largemouth. You don't have to get them pissed off. Smallmouth were born pissed off, trust me. So anyway, back to the setup. You know, I think this is a 1/8 ounce, and I don't know who makes this particular head, but man, you'll find them everywhere. I like a weed guard. If you find that you're having some issues, sometimes on some hooks, that weed guard can cause problems with hookups. So, you know, if you're around, again, just the rock, you're not around a lot of other cover, then you can get away with not having that weed guard. But here lately, because of the water levels on the lakes that I'm fishing, we're fishing around a lot of wood, a lot of laydowns, a lot of debris. So, you know, got to kind of have that to stay weedless. And it really seems like this year, that wacky rig is really what's produced the most for me. So, you know, this is a 1/8. Like I said, I was using the Ned, the TRD head, the turd head, whatever you want to call it, that actually had the weed guard on it when I was on Cumberland. You know, you got to travel light as a co-angler, so sometimes you've got to just make one thing that's designed for a particular use work for another. And that head worked pretty well. The rod, again, basically a 7-foot medium action, you know, spinning combo. You know, I'm going to use 6 to 8 pound test line. Now, you know, a lot of that's going to be also determined by water clarity. You know, if you've got super clear water and for some reason those smallmouth are up a little shallower in that clear water, you're going to want to definitely use that 6 pound test over that 8. It'll help you get a few more bites and hopefully a few more bass that'll actually commit to the bait. Now, this is a Shimano Sierra. This is a 3000, 2500, 3000, work just perfect. Again, just the combo you're happy with. Medium fast action, 2500 to 3000, you're golden. 6 to 8 pound test. The worms, I love the Holston ST. Like I said, green, the 3 colors. I mean, I keep it real simple, green. This is the bold bluegill color, and of course the Morning Dawn. The other worm that I like, and you know, again, you've seen us use robo worms. I don't know what all we actually threw, but a lot of it, the Torpedo by Bass Munitions, I actually threw that some, caught a couple of fish on that. And one of my other favorites is the Crawler by Bass Munitions, but you know, there's a lot of difference out there in the market. The one good thing about using the Bass Munitions worms, guys, A, they don't have a lot of salt content, so they float. It's a very slow fall. B, they're very durable. And C, I've got a discount code in the description, so make sure you go check those out. I know, shameless plug. I had to do it though. Anyway, let's go on to bait number 3. So let's go over my setup, and it's pretty much identical to the other 3 setups. So the Ned rig. Generally, I like to use the heaviest head I can get my hands on, which is the 1/5 that Z-Man makes. It just allows me to be able to fish that particular bait, the Ned rig, from shallow to deep. Most of the time I'm going to use the Z-Man because it's Elastec, but you really don't have to do that. The Elastec, the big key to this bait is that you want to find a soft plastic that doesn't have a lot of salt in it. So like Senkos actually don't work real well for the Ned rig because they're so salt laden that they're really heavy. But you know, you can get away with a lot of different soft plastics. You got a 6'5" to 7 foot, you know, maybe a 7'2", 7'3", but right in that area. You don't really want to get much farther than that because a lot of times you're going to be making accurate casts. So that 6'5" to 7 foot, medium action, or medium power, fast action rod is what you're going to really go for. This one, it's a Halo, and I've got a Lose speed spin on here, and this is a 300, which basically is a loose version of a 3,000 reel. Again, a 2,500 to a 3,000, that's going to be the reel that you're going to want to use. Again, 6 to 8 pound test, same thing. Pretty much all three setups are dead on identical. So now let's back up, let's go to bait number 1, and let's go look at how we're going to actually fish that bait. All right guys, so I'm going to show you how we fish the little green worm, or for me, the Bass Munitions, South Holston ST. Again, 3/16 ounce weight. So what I like to do is I like to make a cast really right up to the bank, just a few inches off of it. And then I'm just going to let it sit there. And the key really to all three of these baits is you're dragging it. You're not losing bottom contact. You might shake it just a little, but you don't want to move it when you shake it. So you want to make sure that you keep that rod tip at about a 9 o'clock. And what you're going to want to do is just barely lift it up to about 10 or 11. Don't go higher than 11 because you're going to set your hook. Now this isn't going to be, because we're using finessier style baits, you're not going to, jack them. Just pull back, nice, soft, lean into them, kind of hook set. So one of the things you're going to want to make sure you do is you stay in contact with that bait. You're not going to want to let it, too much slack in your line. You'll work that back, and that is pretty much the way it is for all three baits you'll see. So the flick shake. Now we'll do something a little different with the flick shake. I will give it, a couple of shakes because it is wacky rig. So again, same thing, I'm going to cast it up, and a lot of times I'm casting it up right to the edge of the rock, right up to the edge of the shoreline. And the reason I'm casting it up to the edge of the shoreline is because I'm trying to determine the depth. So I'll work it from shallow out to, like we said earlier, that 12, even 15 foot range if I feel like they're going to be that deep. Again, we're just going to make a nice little cast. You can see there I bounced it right off the rock. A little silent entry for you. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it settle, and I'm literally just going to drag it. Now every once in a while I may actually just twitch it just a little bit, and I'm twitching just the slack in the line. I'm not really moving the bait. I mean, the bait is moving, but it is just quivering that worm. It's not really moving the bait itself. And then I'm just going to give it a little drag, reel down my slack. Again, 9 to 10 or 11. I'm not going to go any higher than that. Every once in a while I'll just give it a little shake, drop it down, watch it hit the bottom, and I'll work it, like I said, out to about 12, 15 feet when I'm trying to determine the depth these fish are at. So the third bait, the Ned rig, and again guys, it's the same thing. We're just going to throw it right up as close to the bank as we can get it. Now, one of the reasons why I actually like to cast close to the bank, even if they're out a little bit deeper, is because I just think, for me, it seems like I get more bites if I work it down to them. Now that's not always the case, but it seems like dropping it on their head doesn't seem to get the bites as it does just kind of dragging it down and into the bed. But again, what we're going to do is we're going to reel the slack up, we're going to drag it down, and I'm going to let it sit there for a second. I'm going to move it just a few inches at a time. I'm going to drag it down, I'm going to let it sit there. Now this is a lot slower until you really get on them or get on a bank that's got them loaded up on it. Once you tag into one, it's like I said, you can see how close to the bank I am. We're fishing 6 to 8 pound test line. This is close quarters combat with some really good smallmouth bass, and I mean it is a blast because they're jumping, they're fighting, they're digging. Guys, they don't lay down, they don't give up. All right, so I hope this helps you go out and be able to target and find and catch a smallmouth of a lifetime for you, whether it's this year or next year when they're on the beds. I know it's one of my favorite times of years when they get up in the shallows. They're so fun, they're so aggressive, they fight so much. You're fighting these, these 4, 5, and if you're lucky, 6 pound smallmouth. Even the 2s and 3s are an incredible fight. You're close to the bank. It's close quarters combat with, light rods, light reels, light line. And we all know, and if you don't, I apologize that you've never caught a smallmouth, because it's awesome. It's awesome. When you're in close quarters combat, it is awesome. So like I said, any questions about this or about any of the setups or how we fish it, any questions about, you know, fishing for spawning smallmouth, shoot them to me in the description below. Like it if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe, and you guys rock.